For the Unit 1 case study, I picked ESPN Fantasy Crisis. So what happened was back in 2016, during week 1 of the NFL season, ESPN Fantasy's app and website both crashed. This didn't allow users to edit their lineups before games started, as well as check scores during week 1. I picked this case study because I thought it was interesting looking at PR from this point of view, because usually you just think of athletes and teams and organizations, as well as I personally play ESPN Fantasy Football, and I remember the site going down in 2016. So pretty much what the case study actually looked at was ESPN's response to this crisis and how they went about it. They did this by looking at the tweets during the crisis of ESPN, ESPN Fantasy, and Matthew Berry. They also looked at the reaction from users, and they also went about this by looking at Twitter and looking at tweets and whether the comments were positive or negative or neutral. And the findings that they came out with through this process was that if you give a name or a face to the account that's tweeting out the information, the negative responses are much lower. In this case, Matthew Berry, when he tweeted, his comments on his post were less negative than the comments on ESPN and ESPN Fantasies. The questions that I'm going to be answering, the first one is, if you were in charge of the social media account for ESPN Fantasy during this technological failure, which of Smith's crisis strategies would you have employed and why? So Smith's crisis strategies were pretty much just strategies that an organization could use to manage a crisis. I would personally do some things very similar to what ESPN did during the crisis, but I think also there's a couple things that I would change. So first off, the strategy that they used was showing empathy and acknowledging that there's a problem. I think I also would have done this. However, in the case study, it said it took them about an hour until after the problem came to release a statement. I think they should have done that a little bit sooner, and as soon as they realized that their site was down, they should have came out with something. The next strategy that they used was letting everybody know that they're working on finding the solution. I think this is very important, letting your consumers know that you're trying to fix the problem and you're working towards a solution. And the last strategy, which they didn't necessarily use, but I think they could have used, was the diverting method, where you take the problem away from the current problem and you give them something else to look at or do. And I think what ESPN could have done is, while users couldn't look at the scores necessarily of their fantasy team, I think they could have tweeted out updates, maybe at halftime saying how many points each player has, or whenever a player scores a touchdown, they could have done that, so users were still able to track the performance of their players on their fantasy team. The next question I'm going to look at is, if you were creating best practice guidelines for your social media managers during a fantasy sport crisis, what would you include? I think I kind of covered this in the previous question, but I think it's very important to jump on your problem right away. As soon as you realize that there's a problem, I think you have to reach out and show empathy and let everybody know that there's a problem. Because I know me personally, when something's not working or something's down, I think it's just me, and that gets me very frustrated. So as soon as I find out that it's down and it's not just me, that frustration goes away a little bit. And the next thing I think is important to let everybody know that you're working as hard as you can fix the problem. As well, with this, it's also important to give them continuous updates. It said in the case study that ESPN, it took them about 90 minutes until the first tweet to give an update. I think continuous tweets allows users to understand that you're working and they're not just sitting there waiting, keeping refreshing. Along with this, I don't think it's necessarily good to give them a specific time frame, because when you limit yourself to a specific time frame, if you don't meet that deadline, users are pretty frustrated by that. So I think you simply just use the words, "We're going to get it back up as soon as we can." That lets them know that you're working as hard as you can to get it back up, but if you don't meet the deadline, then you won't have that frustration. The last question that I'm going to look at is what are all the current ways fantasy sport providers are using social media platforms? In today's day and age, we can very clearly see this with COVID. ESPN was able to learn from the problem in 2016, and they were able to jump ahead of this COVID season of fantasy football. They came out and told all their users what their plan was, and what they essentially said was that if a game is moved due to COVID, you move to a Tuesday, it'll still count for that week. They also said that if a player tests positive and is on the COVID list, you can put them on their IR, so you're still able to pick up players. They also said that if one of your players is in your starting lineup and has COVID, you can have a backup in play, and that the commissioner is able to go back in and to fix that after the week. So as we can see, ESPN and fantasy sports, they've learned from what happened in 2016, and they were able to manage